Another good thing about this is I will be singing all the specials during this time. All right. 1 Samuel tonight, in the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 20. Get my notes. 1 Samuel chapter 20. Look at just the first three verses here. A couple of points I want to bring out about this tonight, especially in light of everything that's going on right now in the world. But 1 Samuel chapter 20, the first three verses. And David fled from Naioth in Ramah and came and said before Jonathan, "What have I done? What is mine iniquity? What is my sin before thy father, that he seeketh my life?" And he said unto him, "God forbid, thou shalt not die. Behold, my father will do nothing, either great or small, but that he will show it me. And why should my father hide this thing from me? It is not so." And David sware moreover and said, "Thy father certainly knoweth that I have found grace in thine eyes. And he saith, Let not Jonathan know this, lest he be grieved. But truly, as the Lord liveth, and as thy soul liveth, there is but a step between me and death." That's what I like to preach on. There's just but a step between me and death. Let's go ahead and pray. Father in heaven, Lord, I love you. I thank you for your word. Lord, I ask your blessing upon the message tonight. Lord, I pray that you be glorified and honored in all that's said and done. And Lord, I pray that this would be a help and would strengthen us. Bless our church, Lord. Help us to be a light here in Anchorage. And bless our people. And even as those who are listening, Father, the majority of our church at home right now, Lord, we pray that you would bless and you'd still work in this. Lord, that would be a help and draw us closer to you. And Lord, if there's anyone who is not saved, Lord, we certainly do pray for their salvation who is hearing this evening. Lord, I love you and I pray and ask all this in Christ's name. Amen. I almost start out with a little bit different text, and that is going into the wise man and the foolish man. At the conclusion of the Sermon on the Mount, it's there in Matthew chapter 7. I might go into that on Sunday. I'm not sure yet, still praying about that. But if I was to ask the question, when did the foolish man realize that his house wasn't strong enough? It wasn't until the storm hit. Before then, he thought he was fine. That's when faith is tested. It's not when everything's fine. It's when everything falls apart. That's when faith is tested. Your strength isn't tested until there's something that requires you to use strength. That's when it's tested. For instance, here with David right now. What is taking place by the time you come up to 1 Samuel chapter 20 is David has been fleeing off and on from King Saul, who's been trying to kill him. Now, in chapter 19, it's the last time he flees from his house. It's over with. He officially, in chapter 20, is starting on the run and basically will be on the run until he becomes king. So this is where that time begins. He's been back and forth. Go back into chapter 19. Jonathan had convinced his father to let David back in, that David honors you. You have no reason to fear. And so he lets David come back in. But once you know it, another battle kicks up with the Philistines. David's the hero. Jealousy comes in. And he goes right back after David, and David has to flee. This time his wife helps him escape. And so we pick it up here with basically David's and Jonathan's last meeting together in 1 Samuel chapter 20. And David, again, he is struggling. He's really having trouble with faith at this time. He is discouraged. Really what David has forgotten is this, is that God is there. Many times it's not, again, as I've already brought up, until the storm hits that the measure of our faith or of our strength is finally revealed. It's not until then. It's also interesting for people you can demonstrate. There are some people who actually, in general, have a measure of strong faith about them. But it's just not that you have strong faith. It's what is that faith resting in? You can have strong faith and have it in the wrong source. You're going to find that will fail you. All right? So it's also what your faith is placed in. David here coming to Jonathan is pleading his case. What have I done? What is going on with your dad? Over and over, he has been trying to kill me. Now again, keep in mind, David has been anointed the next king of Israel. That's what's taken place. Yet even though David is aware of that, many times we too struggle, even though we know what the Lord says. Even though we know what he says in his word, yet we tend to struggle. Think of Abraham and Sarah. Abraham knew, God told him directly, Abraham, you're going to have a child. He knew that was coming. He knew his offspring would lead to this great nation. He had the direct promise of God telling him direct. Yet when it didn't pan out as he thought it should, they took measures into their own hands. And many times days like this come up in our life. We're facing something. And again, we can do much like David, as he does many times. This one I give him a little bit of credit for. But so let me make this statement, and then I'll defend him a little bit. David many times overstates his problems. All right. Now and here I believe he's overstating his problems. Now don't get me wrong. He is right that Saul wants him dead. He's not overstating that. Saul does want him dead, and I have no doubt if Saul were to catch him, David is dead. Saul would kill him. When Saul was throwing the javelin at him, he wanted him dead. You say, then how is David overstating his problem? Because he's not considering God. He's not considering God. He's not seeing it from the right point of view. And when different things pop up in life, when we eliminate God, we overstate it. We overstate it. It's important how we respond when these times arise. And again, hopefully this will help through it as we go through this today. And before I get into the main part of the lesson, let me just cover this now. I usually do this at the end of it, but I'm going to cover it right now. When we are dealing with David saying there's but a step between me and death, the fact is one day you will die. And you had better make sure that you had made that peace with God, as Colossians chapter 1 and verse 20 talks about. Or there is no hope. There is no hope. People right now are very fearful. The coronavirus, they see something that has the potential to spread and kill multitudes. But as Christ said, fear not him who is able to simply destroy the body, but him who can destroy your soul in hell. I'm butchering that verse, but the point is your soul's eternal. And I think of it's actually a little bit convicting watching all of this, is all the response going in from high-level government on down and trying to protect its citizens from this. Yet there's a greater disease affecting people, sin, and a judgment that is coming, and we have the answer to it. It's times like this actually get kind of convicting to realize, something. There's a much greater battle than what's taken. Don't get me wrong. I understand our government's response. I'm not going against that. I get it. If you're making those same calls, but we know what people are facing after they die. So one, you need to make sure that you're at peace with God. You need to make sure there's been a time in your life when you have truly repented and placed your faith in Jesus Christ. That is what's most important. But now, let's get back to David and him thinking death is but a step away. There's three things here that Jonathan tries to point out to David that I want you to see. God's provision, God's protection, and God's promises. First off, let's look at these three. Number one, God's provision. Verse 1. It says, and David fled from Naoth in Ramah and came and said before Jonathan, what have I done? What is mine iniquity? And what is my sin before thy father that he seeketh my life? And he said unto him, God forbid, thou shalt not die. Behold, my father will do anything great or small, but that he will show it me. And why should my father hide this thing from me? It is not so. And then David continues in verse 3, and David sware moreover and said, Thy father certainly knoweth that I have found grace in thine eyes. And he said, Let not Jonathan know this, lest he be grieved. But truly, as the Lord liveth, and as thy soul liveth, there is but a step between me and death. Jonathan's trying to tell him, listen, you're not going to die. Told him direct. What Jonathan's reminding him of here at this discussion is this: you're the next king. Regardless of what my father does, you've been anointed the next king. And you can remember, I have a whole sermon just on Jonathan and the friendship that those two have. And what an amazing friend he was. And Jonathan is such a great example of humility. Because he's the one, David's taking his place as king. David will be the next king, not Jonathan. And Jonathan can easily let that bother him, say, I should be the next king. But he never lets that bother him. He's reminding David, listen, you are to be the next king. You're not going to die. Jonathan had already watched many times the Lord's providence in David's life. Jonathan's reminded, the Lord will take care of you. He's done it over and over and over again. And it's amazing how, and the Lord does this with David, how at the times you need it, he puts an encourager right there. And David needed that right now. And here's Jonathan, you're not going to die, David. You're going to be the next king. And the fact is, God does work on our behalf. We can trust God with our life. We can have peace if we're walking with Him. Romans 8:28 is still true. It hasn't been removed from the Bible. You can think of the different times that will come up in David's life. When David ends up in a cave with Saul, while he's in there, King Saul comes in. He's right there with the army. Yet God protected him. Or the time that King Saul and his army fell asleep there and David walks right up on him. Incredible. God's providence was constantly there in his life. Listen, there's examples when you think about this of God's providence throughout history where you know He's in control. You can think in the Bible. For instance, the book of Esther. I love the book of Esther. God is never mentioned in that book once. He's not in the book by name. But His providence is from chapter 1 till the end. Throughout, you see His providence. You see God in control of the circumstances throughout that book. The king happened not to be able to sleep. Haman on the gallows. You can just see God in control of all of it. The example, for instance, of the birth of Christ. When all of a sudden the decree goes forward, hey, there's a world taxing, we got to do a census, head back to your hometown. Joseph and Mary have to get to Bethlehem. God was in control. We see God in our own history over and over. When we think back to how this country got started, and God's hand on it to become its own nation that wasn't divided. You think of all that we've come through where you can see God's hand in it. I've referred to before some of the battles, for instance, in the Revolutionary War, where you see God's hand. Where you see God's providentially intervening. George Washington, the man who would be our first president, remember the battle of the French and Indian War? When he's there, this is obviously the Revolutionary War, but he was on horseback. Every single officer on horseback was killed but him. It's when he wrote the letter to his brother that he had, what was it? I don't remember what it was now. Like 11 bullet holes in his jacket. He was unscathed. You want to know why? Because there's appointed time to death. It wasn't his time. God knew that man will be president of the United States of America and help lead the revolution that was coming. Again, we can see God's providence throughout. I think it's true of every election because God is in control of world leadership, but wasn't it evident in the last election of God's providence? Sometimes it's just clearer than others. I don't know if before the last election on, what was it, November 2nd? Is that the right date? November 3rd, whenever it was? Whatever that Tuesday was that year. That any of us would have thought that Donald Trump would end up president of the United States. And just to watch that unfold, knowing God is in control. I mean, we can look at events right now in the world, separating from the coronavirus, where we can see God's providence in setting up for the return of Jesus Christ. It's incredible. And think about this. We went through the series in Revelation. I've thought about that a few times this week. This is nothing to what the world is going to face. And this is shutting down America. Wait until something like takes place when those seals, those trumpets, and those vials are released. This is nothing. I know when I look at my own life, I can see God's providence throughout. I can see God's providence. When I look back, it really is just incredible. All of us can probably do the exact same thing. I'm a month away from leaving for Bible college. Less than a month. Done, enrolled, ready to go, convinced it's God's will. And it would have been a Bible college that today I profoundly disagree with in how they present the gospel. Ready to go. And then all of a sudden the thought hits me, I can't afford it. Now, little did I know how easy it actually would be to afford Bible college. I didn't have that concept down. I had no money for college. My brother happens to return, who we weren't close to, he's 3 years older than me. He did 1 year in the Navy, or in college first, and then he did 2 years in the Navy. He just got back from his 2-year stint in the Navy. And he comes to me and he says, he got the GI Bill. So now he had money for college. And just a 2-year stint, he says, just go do 2 years in the military and come out and do it. And so that got it wouldn't leave me alone. And I decided, you know what? On a Friday, I'm going to go talk to the Air Force. I wasn't doing the Navy. I knew, sorry, John, I wasn't doing the Navy. I ain't going to wear those, it ain't happening. And then the Army and the Marines, what are you guys thinking? Really? I mean, come on. I don't get that. So I knew when I went, I was going to talk to the Air Force. So I head down to where all the recruiters' office were. Now I walked in, little did I know the Air Force had their own section in another part of this building, but Army, Navy, and Marines were there. And so a Marine guy met me, and I said, well, where's the Air Force? He said, well, you got to listen to me first. And I said, I'll do that, but I just want to know where the Air Force is. So he talked for about 2 minutes, and I said, I'm still talking to the Air Force. This ain't happening. And so I went down, talked with the Air Force a guy, let him know, listen, I just don't know if I have enough money for college. My brother told me about the GI Bill. So he goes off on that spin and said, yep, we could help cover that. And he really sold me on the Air Force, did a really good job of it. And then he finished with saying it's all what we call delayed enlistment. I believe that's still true to this day. He goes, you'll leave anywhere from 3 months to 12 months out. And I thought about that, and I said, no, that's all right. I said, I'll try the first semester of college, and I'm going to see how that goes. I didn't know I would leave in 3 months. I said, I can go start the semester right now and see how I'm doing. So I left. Saturday morning, he calls my house. Saturday morning, I was home by myself, and he calls up, said, this is, the recruiter, whatever his name was, and he said, you can leave Monday. And he wasn't kidding. I mean, this wasn't even an option on Friday. Never even considered it. When I left there, I never thought about it again. And right there, I'm just praying. I don't have time to call the pastor up. I don't have time. My mom's not home. Nobody. And right there, he goes, I got to know right now if you're doing this. I have to know right now. He goes, you will leave Monday. And I'm just praying. And I said, I'll do it. And he wasn't kidding. I left Monday. I was gone. The first week, I thought I made the worst decision of my life. I was like, what am I doing here? This is ridiculous. But looking back, how the Lord protected me. Remember, I preach a message on Joseph about the will of God and how the will of God finds you. Just stay close to God. The Lord knew the whole time, He's not put me in that college. That ain't happening. I wasn't rebellious. I just wanted to do what He wanted me to do. That's what I wanted. And you know what He did? He intervened providentially and controlled. We can see providence in our life. I could see it when I had the assignment to Korea, looking back, God's providence in my life. And I refuse to see it. And by the way, when you refuse to see God's providence, you will have no peace. That's truth. That's true. Because I've lived it. I got that remote assignment to Korea. 12 months without my family. Could not believe. I'm not kidding. At work, I always said, somewhat jokingly, but also fairly serious, I said, the only place I don't want to go is Korea. They had the two, they had Kunsan, they had Osan, and they were remotes, and Kunsan was the worst of the two, and so I had just graduated Airman Leadership School. It was just a great evening. I had the next day off, and there's all kinds of stuff that went on that evening, and anyhow, I thought the Air Force was great. Then the next day, I'm at home, my boss calls me, he said, you got to come in, you got an assignment. And I thought he was joking, with everything going on. I didn't, but he goes, no, I'm serious, you have to come in. And I said, I'm not coming in. I said, what did I get assigned to? He goes, you're going to Korea. You're going to Kunsan. And then I really thought he was kidding. I said, I'm not coming in. He goes, no, really, you do. You have an assignment. And so I head in there, and back then we called them RIPs. I don't know why we called them RIPs. Does anybody know? They were called RIPs when these papers came down. What is it? Oh, yeah. Well, that was original. Thanks, John. Man, that was brilliant. You come off the top of your head with that one? Wow. But the RIP came down, and I had two on my desk. They were unrelated, all right? The one was there because God knew I'd have no peace about this. I'm already on staff at the church. I'm already getting a salary. I don't even need the Air Force anymore. I'm assistant pastor at the church with Pastor Bird. I just want out. That's all I want. He's training me now, and I just want out, and I have it there. And right next to it, about almost a year prior to this, I applied for a base of preference at Holloman Air Force Base, which nobody in their right mind ever applies for because nobody wants to stay there at Holloman. I applied to lock myself in until my enlistment ended. And those take 60 to 90 days to come through for those military who ever applied for them. They're about 60 to 90-day process for the BOP to get completely done. It's almost a year later. And so I have the BOP on my desk, which was denied because I was just selected for an assignment. Now get this. I have both papers there, and I looked at both. They're both sitting right there on my desk. The BOP, it has the time that this printed and the time that the orders were cut for Kunsan. They were 17 minutes apart. I was selected for the assignment. Then the BOP got processed 17 minutes later, and I was denied because I'd already been selected for an assignment. 17 minutes, which should have been done about 6 months prior to this. It sat somewhere all that. Want to know why? That was God saying, no, you're not staying there. That's not where you're staying. But you know what? For about the next 7-8 months, I failed to see God's providence and was miserable. I did everything I could to get out of the Air Force. Everything I could. Do you understand, looking back now to see how much God's hand was in it? There is no New Guinea then. There is no Alaska. There is no pastor of the Independent Baptist Church of Anchorage. None of that occurs. Because guess where the Air Force sent me after that year? Right to Alaska. Then that's when I got out of the Air Force. I can see God's providence throughout. Arriving here, my very first month in Alaska, God's providence. We just joined the church. We just joined it. And we were over in the warehouse. And Mitch was about 7. And ornery and just couldn't stand him then either. But I went back and all the missionary prayer, I think we supported 22 missionaries when I joined. I can't really remember. I think it was 22. And so all the missionary prayer letters were just on one clipboard. And we had like a cubby hole back where some people sat in that church. It was a warehouse. And so a little cubby hole, and they were back there. And I started going through the church prayer letters, the missionaries we were supporting. And just kind of go through them fairly quickly, not reading every word, but glancing at each prayer letter. And then I got to one from somebody in New Guinea. This is November of 1995. And I remember it just stopped me. And I read every word. I remember when I got home, this is before the internet. I got out the encyclopedia. Going to the country of Papua New Guinea. Something had grabbed me. You know what the Lord was in that day when I grabbed those letters, flipping through them, and all of a sudden one comes up from New Guinea and he says, stop right there. Stop right there. By the way, consider this. This is just fascinating to look back upon, which I had no idea. Where we ended up with the very first church plant in Sohon, right around that same time, a small group of believers that got together started praying God would send a missionary every Thursday morning. Amazing. God's providence. How about coming back to Alaska? Gone for 12 years. I assure you, Mary Ann can tell you this. When we left Alaska that day, October 11th, we drove out in our motorhome. October 11th, we sold our house, moved into the motorhome full time. It was a 29-foot Class C. I bought off a school principal in Seward, Alaska. And it was snowing. It was the first snowfall of the year, that year, October 11th. And as we were driving out of Palmer, going past Buffalo Vine Road, my exact thought was, we'll never live here again. The Lord is permanently moving us from here. That was my thought. And then we head off to New Guinea. And then at the year 10, I'm at the very first national pastors conference I could attend in all my years there. It was on the island. It was usually on the main island. There was just no way I could get to the main island. Just too much going on. But it was on the island south of us, so I went to it for the very first time. And there was nothing spoken in the conference, nothing said, but at the conclusion of one of the services, the inkling hit me for the first time. The Lord's done with me in PNG. I had that first nudge. And began praying about it and praying about it. That was October, after being there for 10 years. October of 2000 and, what year is it? Is that 11 when that hit? No, 2013. October of 2013. Or maybe 14, I don't know. Whatever the 10-year point is. Anyhow, so by that December, that's when it was growing incredibly strong. I'm praying about it now a lot every day. Nobody knows except for Mary Ann. I didn't tell the kids, didn't tell anybody, but now it's heavy on me. And many of you know the story. All of a sudden it comes, it's near the end of January, and I decide I need to call Pastor Roach and get advice on this. Because now I'm getting more and more convinced the Lord is done with us in PNG, and I was at a critical point because I was just getting ready to start. I was already seeking permission from the government of PNG to grow the Bible college, to do what I wanted to do on ground next to me. I had to get the ground rezoned on the house next to me so I could have the facilities there for the Bible college. And so I was thinking already of, I'm going to need to raise some funds from the supporting churches. All this planning is already going, and now I got this going on, and now I'm getting more convinced I think the Lord's done with us here. And I called Pastor Roach up. There was no answer. And just a couple hours later, Jerry Jordan emails me, and he said, call Pastor Roach. Now, in my mind, I thought Pastor Roach just saw caller ID, that I tried calling, and now he's home. I thought the email was just a few hours after I tried calling him, if that. So I called up. I didn't ask him what he wanted. I just went right into what's going on with us. I gave him 5 things that were currently happening circumstantially that were leading him to believe the Lord might be done with us. I went through all of it. Probably took about 5-10 minutes. And then he was saying nothing. I finished. It's just quiet. And that's not him. He's just quiet. And then he speaks. He says, do you know why I wanted you to call? And I said, to be honest, I didn't know you wanted me to call. I said, I thought it was just a callback. He said, no, it wasn't. And then he told me his story. He said the first weekend in January, he said, I met with just the leadership of the church, and I told them I'm retiring and I want the next pastor in place. And he said, they brought you up. He said, I told them, no, I'm not calling him off the field. He said, we met the next week. He said, they brought you up again. And he said, that time I agreed. He said, but I've been given it 1 week praying that you would tell me that the Lord's leading you off the field. At that moment, we both had exactly what we needed. God's providence. We could see him in it. That's what was clear. And know what that gives with the situation? Peace. That's what it gives. It gives peace with it. Not only was Jonathan reminding him of God's providence in his life, but also God's protection. Jonathan had watched the Lord protect David over and over. Whether he does something great or small, David, you're in God's hands. God will protect you. He wanted David to remember these times and not to forget that the Lord is with him. There's many times the Lord protects us and we don't even know it. I remember the worst car wreck that I was ever in was when I was 17. I was bringing a visitor to the church and I was late. So I was moving. I was in a really nice car. This was 1986. The car was about 10 years old, but it was in really good condition. It had really nice tires on it, and I was 16, 17 years old. It was, one of the nicest cars in high school, and it was a Buick Regal. and I was coming. It was raining really good, and I had to come around. It was the same road the church was on. It was a fairly sharp turn, and I was on the yellow line, making that turn way too close to the center line. And so as I came around that turn, probably doing about 40 and a 35 on wet roads, there was another car. He also was close to the yellow line. Not right on it like I was, but right there. And I overcorrected. I saw that, and I jerked the steering wheel to the right, and it started taking that way off, and I was heading right for a farmer's fence, and I jerked the steering wheel back, and at that point, I lost all control. And so the visitor's next to me, and we're heading right for a telephone pole, and I'm moving. I mean, right for it. I just remember barely seeing it flash by, and then the big boom hit, and the car being tossed every which way. I remember the drive shaft coming up by me. I remember that, up through the floorboard. And the car just stopped, and I'm trying to think if I'm all right. I remember my head had hurt a little bit. I was bleeding a little bit on my hip. But other than that, I think I felt all right. And I'm asking the visitor if he's all right. And he said, I think I can't walk. I'm like, yes, you can. I'm like, you're all right. He was a teenager like I was. I didn't know him, but he was some teenage kid that wanted to come to church. And then he said, yeah, no, I am all right. And so we got out, and we went to the farmhouse that was across the way to make a call. And then my best friend, who was the preacher's son, comes driving by. He was late. I didn't know it. And he sees my car totaled. And I hear him outside screaming my name. And I went out there. I'm like, it's okay. We're all right. We're over here. But just to think that night, that morning, how God protected. Pretty much uninjured. Never had to go to the hospital. I was sore for a few days, and that was about it. But just remembering how we're heading right for a telephone pole, and then seeing it flash by and just hit the side of the car. And the telephone pole was down. That thing just crashed, smacked down. That was on the ground. Look at. Well, let's see what time. Well, a great psalm that deals with God's protection. I wanted to read it. Actually, I'm going to read it. I'll shorten another area of this. I want to read Psalm 91. Look at Psalm 91. I think that's a great psalm for right now. Somebody has removed Psalm from my Bible. Wow. Bob Seitz, wake up. I know you're sleeping at home right now. Psalm 91. He that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. I will save the Lord. He is my refuge and my fortress, my God. In him will I trust. Surely he shall deliver thee from the snare of the fowler, and look at this, and from the noisome pestilence. He shall cover thee with his feathers, and under his wings shalt thou trust. His truth shall be thy shield and buckler. Thou shalt not be afraid for the terror by night, nor for the arrow that flieth by day, nor for the pestilence that walketh in darkness, nor for the destruction that wasteth at noonday. 1,000 shall fall at thy side, and 10,000 at thy right hand, but it shall not come nigh thee. Only with thine eyes shalt thou behold and see the reward of the wicked. Because thou hast made the Lord, which is my refuge, even the Most High, thy habitation. That's a direct tie into verse 1. There shall no evil befall thee, neither shall any plague come nigh thy dwelling. For he shall give his angels charge over thee to keep thee in all thy ways. They shall bear thee up in their hands, lest thou dash thy foot against a stone. Thou shalt tread upon the lion and adder, the young lion and the dragon. Thou shalt trample under feet. Because he has set his, look at this, isn't it amazing? Because he has set his love upon me. Therefore will I deliver him. I will set him on high because he hath known my name. Now, do you understand whose love is set upon here in verse 14? That's dealing with the psalmist on God. He shall call upon me, and I will answer him. I will be with him in trouble. I will deliver him and honor him. With long life will I satisfy him and show him my salvation. That is a great psalm. And it deals with the person who simply has chosen to love God and put him first. That's the key. God's protection goes right with it. The other ones I won't turn to. I think Psalm 8 is a great one to read right now. One of my favorite accounts in the Bible dealing with God's protection is 2 Kings chapter 6. I wanted to read it. I won't for time's sake. But 12 through 17, you really have to pick it up in verse 1, but 12 through 17, you'll get the gist of what's taking place there. That's where the king of Syria is just furious because somebody's given away his battle plans. He wants to know who the spy is. Finally, somebody tells him, he says, actually, you don't have a spy. You got a prophet, Elisha. That's your problem. And so he says, go get him. I want him. So he sends a significant portion of his army to go get Elijah. So one morning, his servant wakes up and heads out of the house. He's stretching, and the Syrian army is showing up. He runs back in, scared to death because of the circumstances. The army is out there. I mean, that's worse than the coronavirus. The army's out there. But Elijah's just fine. You get down to, verse 17 and 18. And he says, they that before us are much more than those who are against us. And he makes this prayer to God. He says, Lord, I pray thee, open the young man's eyes that he may see. And the Lord opened his eyes, it says, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots round about Elisha. That's just about a direct quote, I think, of that verse. Now, it never says that Elisha saw that, by the way. His servant saw it. But Elijah trusted God. What he knew was, I'm in God's hands. He's in control. There's nothing going to happen to me that God doesn't allow. And you know what he did? He rested in that, God's protection. And of course, the servant saw that, and we know what happens with the story. The Lord blinds him on. Elijah single-handedly leads that army. But it's just a great story. You have to go back and read it tonight. It's really good. Lastly, of course, let me just cover this one briefly here, the promises of God. David had the promise he'd be the next king. He needed to remember God's promises. So do we. Stay focused on God's promises, like Matthew chapter 6, 25 through 33, like Hebrews chapter 13, verse 5 and 6. Where it talks about that I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. By the way, it's interesting. I always usually just 5 is quoted with it, but verse 6, we shouldn't forget verse 6 with the context of that. It says, so that, when he says, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee, in verse 5, so that we may boldly say, the Lord is my helper. Or verses like Philippians 4:19. David needed to think on God's promise that he would in fact be the next king. Listen, had he sat down and considered God's providence, God's protection, and God's promises, he'd have had a whole lot more peace. He'd had a whole lot more peace. With heads bowed and eyes closed.